By the summer of 1940, Romania found itself strategically isolated, territorially diminished, and politically destabilized. In just a few months, the country lost over one-third of its national territory without a single shot fired. Northern Bukovina and Bessarabia were annexed by the Soviet Union in June, following an ultimatum backed by Soviet military deployment along the Prut River. Then came the Second Vienna Award in August, arbitrated by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, which compelled Romania to cede northern Transylvania to Hungary. Finally, in September, southern Dobruja was transferred to Bulgaria under the Treaty of Craiova. For many Romanians, these territorial amputations, amounting to more than 99,000 square kilometers and nearly 7 million inhabitants, were not only a national humiliation, but also a profound crisis of sovereignty. The internal political structure of Romania, already fragile, began to fracture under the strain of these external losses. King Carol II, once the central figure of Romanian politics, faced growing opposition from both the military and the increasingly radicalized Iron Guard. As discontent mounted, General Ion Antonescu, a career officer with a reputation for discipline and nationalism, forced the king to abdicate in September 1940. Antonescu assumed dictatorial powers as conductor, forging a temporary alliance with the Iron Guard to consolidate his rule. However, the relationship quickly deteriorated. After a failed Iron Guard rebellion in January 1941, Antonescu suppressed the movement and placed the entire state under military governance. Internationally, Romania's strategic alignment shifted dramatically. Traditionally a Francophile nation with close ties to the United Kingdom and France, Romania had now lost its Western patrons. The rapid collapse of France and the growing power of Nazi Germany left Bucharest with few alternatives. In November 1940, Romania officially joined the Tripartite Pact, aligning itself with the Axis powers. This decision was not made lightly. Germany offered military guarantees and economic incentives, while also providing technical and logistical assistance to modernize the Romanian army. By contrast, the Soviet Union remained a looming threat to the east, its intentions opaque but fierce. Romania's participation in Hitler's anti-Soviet coalition was not purely ideological. Rather, it was driven by a combination of geopolitical necessity, national revanchism, and strategic opportunism. The German military mission in Romania, initiated in October 1940, brought thousands of Wehrmacht advisors and trainers into the country. Their stated purpose was to defend the vital Ploiești oil fields, responsible for a significant portion of Axis fuel supplies. But their presence also reinforced the idea that Romania's security and territorial integrity now depended on Berlin, not London or Paris. Military preparations accelerated throughout early 1941. By the time Operation Barbarossa was launched on June 22nd, Romania fielded approximately 35,000 troops alongside the German 11th Army. Under the unified Southern Front, led by German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Romanian forces were concentrated primarily in Army Group Antonescu, consisting of the 3rd and 4th Armies. Their initial objectives included the reconquest of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, territories lost less than a year earlier. Public sentiment in Romania was complex and varied. Among the political elite and military leadership, there was widespread support for regaining lost territories, particularly those seized by the Soviet Union. Propaganda campaigns emphasized themes of national renewal, anti-communism, and historical destiny. However, among civilians, especially in rural regions, mobilization was met with a mix of resignation, fatalism, and confusion. Few understood the broader strategic calculus, and fewer still grasped the full scale of the coming campaign. Soviet intelligence was not unaware of Romania's intentions. Reports of troop movements and German military buildup in Romania reached Moscow by spring 1941. However, the Soviet leadership, including Stalin himself, discounted many of these warnings. There was a prevailing belief that Hitler would not risk a two-front war before completing operations in the West. This miscalculation would have grave consequences. When German and Romanian forces crossed the Prut River on June 22nd, Soviet border defenses were caught largely unprepared, despite the formal existence of the southwestern and southern fronts under generals Mikhail Kirponos and Ivan Tyulenev. Thus, Romania's entry into the war against the Soviet Union was not the product of coercion or ideological alignment alone. It was the result of a cascading series of events, territorial losses, regime change, and strategic realignment, set against the backdrop of a rapidly polarizing European war. Romania sought to recover its lost provinces and secure its eastern frontier, but the means by which it pursued these aims would ultimately reshape its military, political, and moral landscape for decades to come. On the morning of June 22, 1941, Romanian forces crossed the Prut River in concert with the German Wehrmacht, initiating what the Romanian government termed a holy war for the liberation of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. For the Soviet Union, it marked the beginning of a massive German-led invasion that would stretch from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies, together comprising over 25,000 troops, were assigned to the southern axis of Operation Barbarossa, coordinated under the command structure of Army Group South. The 3rd Army, under General Petre Dumitrescu, was tasked with pushing northeast through northern Bessarabia, while the 4th Army, led by General Nicolae Tsiuperca, advanced into the southern sectors. Initial resistance from the Soviet 9th and 18th Armies was disorganized. Many Red Army units, caught off guard by the speed and scale of the Axis offensive, retreated or surrendered. However, in certain pockets, such as the defense of Balti and along the Dniester River, Soviet units mounted stiff resistance, causing Romanian and German units to expend considerable resources to secure their objectives. Romanian participation in these opening operations was characterized by conventional infantry assaults, limited armor support, and intensive artillery barrages. Romania's armored capabilities were modest. Its tank force consisted primarily of outdated Renault R-35s and Czech-built LT-VZ-35s. Against Soviet T-26s, BT-7s, and KV-1s, Romanian armor proved largely ineffective, and tank engagements were generally left to the Germans. Romanian air support, provided by the Aeronautica Regala Romana, contributed to initial air superiority operations, flying alongside the Luftwaffe's Fliegerkorps 4 in coordinated attacks on Soviet airfields and rail hubs. In civilian areas, the outbreak of fighting brought immediate displacement. Thousands of people, Romanians, Ukrainians, Jews, and others, fled advancing armies, either fearing reprisals or seeking safety. In regions with mixed populations, allegiances were complex. Some ethnic Romanians welcomed the Romanian army as liberators, especially in areas formerly under Soviet rule. Others, particularly in urban centers, were skeptical or hostile, recalling the social reforms and industrialization programs introduced under Soviet occupation. Casualties began to mount early. In the first 3 weeks of operations, Romanian forces reported over 1,000 killed, wounded, or missing. By July 5th, most of Bessarabia had been retaken, and on July 9th, the Romanian government declared the re-establishment of Romanian sovereignty over the territories lost in 1940. However, the campaign did not stop there. Under German urging and with the approval of Antonescu, Romanian forces continued to push beyond the Dniester River into Soviet territory proper, specifically into Transnistria and toward Odessa. This decision marked a fundamental shift. The war, which had begun as a campaign to reclaim historically Romanian lands, now extended into a full-scale invasion of Ukraine under Axis objectives. Romanian troops advanced toward the southern Bug River, engaging in battles at Vapni Arca, Balta, and further east. German-Romanian coordination became more complex as distances grew and terrain became more challenging. Supply lines lengthened, logistical networks strained, and Romanian commanders began to voice concerns about operating deep within Soviet territory without clear strategic guarantees. The issue of command and control also became prominent. While nominally autonomous, Romanian units were subordinated to German strategic planning. Disagreements arose over resource allocation, battle planning, and the use of Romanian troops in secondary or high-risk roles. tensions emerged, particularly around the Battle of Odessa, where Romanian troops were tasked with a prolonged and bloody siege, with limited German support. Meanwhile, within Romania, the extension of the war stirred mixed reactions. While the initial recovery of Bessarabia was celebrated, the decision to press beyond traditional national boundaries led to growing unease. Rumors of heavy losses, poor conditions at the front, and atrocities committed against civilians and prisoners began to filter back home, though heavily censored in state-controlled media. The military, for its part, faced mounting challenges: rising desertion rates, shortages of food and ammunition, and diseases such as dysentery and typhus that spread rapidly among frontline units. The Soviet response was evolving. Initial chaos gave way to defensive regrouping. Units of the Red Army, now under orders from Stalin to hold at all costs, began launching localized counterattacks and scorched earth tactics. Bridges were destroyed, grain stores burned, and civilians evacuated in haste. As the front widened, the fighting increasingly resembled a war of attrition, with both sides settling into prolonged engagements rather than rapid breakthroughs. For Romanian soldiers, the war had transformed quickly from a mission of national restoration to one of occupation and endurance. By late July, they had extended their control well beyond the pre-war frontiers, entering unfamiliar and often hostile territory. The early optimism of June gave way to the realities of sustained warfare, and with each kilometer gained, the risks and the costs continued to grow. The strategic rationale for Romania's continued involvement in the Eastern Front evolved rapidly following the early successes of Operation Barbarossa. While the initial goal, recovering Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, had largely been achieved by early July 1941, the Romanian leadership, particularly Marshal Ion Antonescu, chose to deepen their commitment. This decision was not purely military, but rooted in a convergence of political, ideological, and economic factors that aligned with the broader goals of Nazi Germany's campaign in the East. Antonescu's belief in the ideological struggle against Bolshevism was not unique within Axis leadership circles. However, for Romania, the continuation of the war beyond its national frontiers was also seen as a means to secure German favor. Antonescu understood that any post-war settlement would be dictated largely by Berlin, and he hoped that further participation would ensure the permanent return of Romanian territories lost to the USSR, and possibly even territorial gains in Ukraine. The German leadership, including Hitler himself, encouraged such ambitions. In various communications, Romania was promised control over the Transnistrian region, stretching from the Dniester to the southern Bug, as compensation and strategic buffer. The occupation of Transnistria posed complex logistical and administrative challenges. The region included major cities such as Odessa and Tiraspol, and had a diverse population composed of Ukrainians, Russians, Jews, and others. Administering such a territory, devastated by retreating Soviet forces and ongoing warfare, required not just military resources but civilian governance infrastructure, which Romania lacked at the time. Nonetheless, Romania accepted the responsibility and established a civil administration under Governor Gheorghe Alexianu. Romanian gendarmes and administrative personnel were dispatched to oversee governance, reconstruction, and security. Meanwhile, German expectations of Romania were increasing, with most Wehrmacht divisions redeployed further east towards central Ukraine and the Caucasus. The responsibility for stabilizing and defending the southern flank fell increasingly on Romanian forces. This included securing long supply lines, protecting captured infrastructure such as railway hubs and bridges, and combating partisan activity that escalated quickly behind the front lines. The Romanian army, designed primarily for territorial defense and not for extended occupation or counterinsurgency, struggled to adapt. Romanian military doctrine had not been revised significantly since the interwar period and emphasized traditional infantry maneuvers, limited mechanization, and weak logistical support systems. The long distances and harsh conditions of the Soviet steppe exposed these limitations. Fuel shortages, inadequate winter equipment, and poor communications further strained Romanian operations. For example, many Romanian troops deployed in Ukraine continued to rely on horse-drawn transport, while their German counterparts increasingly used mechanized columns. In terms of supply lines, Romania's dependence on its oil infrastructure in Ploiești became more critical. The Germans pressured Romania to prioritize fuel exports to the Reich, leading to domestic rationing and occasional shortages for the Romanian military itself. Simultaneously, Romanian industry struggled to keep up with the demand for ammunition, replacement parts, and food supplies. German logistical support was uneven and often prioritized German units, further complicating Romanian planning. Propaganda played a central role in sustaining morale and justifying the campaign. State media in Romania portrayed the advance into Soviet territory as a continuation of a historical civilizing mission, drawing on cultural and historical references to the medieval Principality of Moldavia and its connections to lands east of the Dniester. Anti-Semitic and anti-communist rhetoric was widely disseminated, reinforcing the ideological justification for the war. Yet, censorship also obscured the growing number of casualties and the true scale of suffering at the front. Within the army, morale began to show signs of strain. The initial optimism that had accompanied the liberation of Romanian territory faded as casualties mounted and the front moved further into unfamiliar territory. By late summer 1941, many soldiers had been in continuous combat for over 2 months. Unit cohesion suffered, and desertion rates, though initially low, began to increase. Field reports indicated fatigue, hunger, and psychological stress among the rank and file. Efforts to rotate units or provide rest periods were hampered by the constant demands of maintaining the extended front. Civilian responses were varied and complex. In the newly occupied territories, some segments of the population viewed the Romanians more favorably than the retreating Soviet authorities, especially those disillusioned with collectivization and political repression. However, these sentiments were often fleeting. The harsh occupation policies, expropriations, forced labor, and reprisals soon eroded any goodwill. In Odessa, the Romanian administration faced a particularly hostile population and a growing partisan movement. The city became a flashpoint for both military operations and political retaliation. Meanwhile, relations between Romanian and German officers were increasingly marked by tension. While both militaries shared broad strategic goals, Romanian commanders often felt sidelined in joint operations. Complaints about German arrogance, unequal distribution of resources, and disregard for Romanian losses became more frequent. German command, for its part, viewed the Romanian army as less reliable and under-equipped. These mutual perceptions would later contribute to breakdowns in coordination during larger operations. The gap between strategic ambition and operational capacity became evident as Romanian forces were tasked with increasingly complex and high-risk missions. From defending key transport corridors to conducting anti-partisan sweeps in the dense forests and marshlands of Ukraine, Romanian units were constantly stretched thin. Despite their numerical strength, their effectiveness was hampered by logistical fragility and lack of modern equipment. By the autumn of 1941, Romania was no longer simply a junior partner in the Axis war effort. It was now a critical player on the southern front, bearing a growing share of the military burden. Yet, with each step deeper into Soviet territory, the Romanian campaign became less about recovery and more about survival. The promise of strategic rewards was matched by the emerging reality of long-term entanglement in a brutal, attritional conflict whose end remained uncertain. By October 1941, the Romanian army had reached the outskirts of Odessa, a major port city on the Black Sea, and the last significant Soviet stronghold west of the Dniester. Capturing the city became both a military imperative and a symbolic goal for Romanian leadership. The German High Command had delegated the responsibility for taking Odessa almost entirely to Romania, regarding it as a test of their allies' capabilities. For Marshal Antonescu, success would demonstrate Romania's strategic value and justify its deeper role in the Eastern Campaign. The Siege of Odessa, which lasted from August 8 to October 16, 1941, proved to be among the costliest and most protracted operations undertaken by the Romanian army. Approximately 34,000 Romanian troops, organized under the Fourth Army, faced a determined Soviet defense led by the separate Coastal Army, reinforced by elements of the Black Sea Fleet and approximately 35,000 local militia and naval personnel. The Soviets had transformed Odessa into a heavily fortified defensive zone with 3 concentric rings of trenches, concrete bunkers, barbed wire, minefields, and artillery positions. Romanian advances were slow and costly. Initial frontal assaults failed to penetrate Soviet defenses, and attempts to outflank the city from the north and east were repelled with significant losses. The Romanian army lacked the heavy artillery and engineer units needed for urban siege warfare. In the first month alone, Romanian casualties exceeded 27,000, with divisions such as the 5th and 15th Infantry suffering particularly heavy losses. Soviet defenders, although outnumbered, conducted effective counterattacks and maintained supply lines through the Black Sea, using naval convoys to ferry reinforcements and ammunition. To compensate for their material disadvantage, Romanian commanders increased the use of infantry waves and night assaults, tactics that resulted in even higher attrition. By mid-September, after weeks of grueling combat, Romanian forces finally breached the outer defensive belts and approached the urban periphery. Street fighting and house-to-house combat intensified, with sniper fire, booby traps, and underground fortifications turning every advance into a deadly grind. On October 16th, Soviet command ordered the evacuation of Odessa by sea. Approximately 86,000 troops, along with thousands of civilians and wounded personnel, were withdrawn to Sevastopol. Romanian forces entered the city the following day. The fall of Odessa was hailed in Bucharest as a national triumph. A victory parade was held, and Antonescu received congratulatory messages from Hitler and other Axis leaders. However, the victory came at a high cost. Over 9,000 Romanian casualties were recorded during the siege, including more than 17,000 dead. In the aftermath, Romanian authorities assumed full control of Odessa and its surrounding region. The occupation was placed under the administration of the Transnistrian Governorate, with Gheorghe Alexianu appointed as governor. Almost immediately, resistance activity surged. Soviet partisans, aided by local sympathizers and coordinated from across the southern Bug, carried out sabotage operations, assassinations, and intelligence gathering. On October 22nd, a bomb detonated at Romanian military headquarters in Odessa, killing over 60 officers and civilians, including General Ion Glogogeanu. The response was swift and brutal. Under orders from Antonescu, Romanian forces executed large-scale reprisals. Over the next 3 days, between 19,000 and 25,000 civilians, mostly Jews and suspected partisans, were executed or deported. These events, known as the Odessa Massacre, marked one of the largest acts of reprisal conducted by Romanian forces during the war. They also deepened the cycle of violence and resistance in the region, turning Odessa into a contested and volatile occupation zone. Elsewhere along the front, Romanian units continued to advance eastward in support of German operations. The Third Army was redeployed north to participate in the offensive toward the lower Dnieper and the Crimean Peninsula. Romanian divisions supported German attempts to encircle Soviet forces near Melitopol and in the Perekop Isthmus, the narrow land bridge into Crimea. However, these operations strained already depleted Romanian formations. Winter was approaching, and most Romanian soldiers lacked adequate clothing, boots, and shelter for sub-zero conditions. The operational tempo, combined with poor logistics, led to high rates of illness and frostbite. Typhus, pneumonia, and exposure claimed thousands of additional casualties. Romanian supply lines, often reliant on horse-drawn transport and deteriorating rail networks, failed to deliver sufficient provisions. Soldiers scrounged for firewood, improvised footwear, and looted local villages in search of food. Despite the harsh conditions, orders from Bucharest emphasized the need to maintain discipline and continue operations alongside the German advance. On the diplomatic front, Romania's deepening role in the war was recognized with increasing, though limited, respect by Germany. The Reich continued to supply Romania with military equipment, primarily captured Soviet hardware and outdated German models. Romanian forces received Panzer 35T, tanks, field guns, and Stuka dive bombers, but they remained dependent on Berlin for critical support. Despite these limitations, Antonescu used the momentum to strengthen Romania's position in the Axis hierarchy. A visit to Hitler's headquarters in November 1941 reaffirmed Romania's strategic role and cemented Antonescu's image as a loyal partner. However, concerns were mounting within Romania's political and military circles. The original goal of recovering Bessarabia and Bukovina had been achieved. The continued advance into Soviet territory raised questions about Romania's strategic interests, especially as casualties escalated and the cost of occupation mounted. Economic pressures intensified. While the country benefited from access to Ukrainian grain and Soviet material stockpiles, the overall burden of war financing, troop maintenance, and infrastructure repair outweighed short-term gains. Public opinion, tightly managed by censorship, began to erode in subtle ways. Letters from the front reported not only heroism, but exhaustion, hunger, and frustration. Civilian rationing, inflation, and the growing number of war widows and wounded veterans generated quiet discontent. The Orthodox Church remained a key supporter of the war effort, promoting it as a sacred mission, but its influence could not fully suppress the underlying fatigue spreading through society. By the end of 1941, Romania had gone far beyond its initial war aims. It had assumed control of a vast and unstable region, suffered over 1,000 casualties in 6 months, and committed itself to a prolonged and increasingly uncertain campaign. The decisions made during this period would shape the trajectory of Romania's wartime role, and determine the depth of its entanglement in a war whose final outcome no longer lay within its control. The winter of 1941-1942 marked a new phase in Romania's military engagement on the Eastern Front. Following the fall of Odessa and the occupation of Transnistria, Romanian forces found themselves entrenched deep within Soviet territory, tasked with holding extended front lines while managing the administrative and security demands of occupied regions. For many Romanian soldiers and officers, this period was one of stagnation, fatigue, and adaptation to conditions far beyond what their command had anticipated. Romania's 3rd and 4th Armies remained the principal formations deployed in the east. The 3rd Army, commanded by General Petre Dumitrescu, was assigned to defensive positions along the Mias and Donets rivers, supporting German operations in the Donbass industrial region. The 4th Army, under General Constantin Constantinescu-Claps, remained responsible for garrisoning Odessa and the Transnistrian hinterland. These dual responsibilities, frontline warfare and occupation, placed immense pressure on Romanian logistics, manpower, and morale. Winter conditions across southern Ukraine were severe. Temperatures frequently dropped below 25 WWII, and many Romanian units lacked proper cold weather gear. Supply chains were disrupted by snowfall, frozen rivers, and partisan sabotage. Thousands of Romanian troops suffered from frostbite and exposure. Makeshift shelters offered little protection, and the inadequacy of clothing, particularly boots and gloves, became a recurring theme in soldiers' letters and internal army reports. In response to the deteriorating situation, the Romanian High Command attempted several measures. Emergency requisitions of wool, leather, and fuel were organized from Romanian domestic production, but industrial capacity was insufficient to meet demand. German logistics prioritized their own units, and while some aid was extended to Romanian allies, it remained inadequate. Desertion increased during this period, particularly among conscripts from rural backgrounds unaccustomed to prolonged absence from home or exposure to such extreme environments. The growing partisan threat further complicated matters. In Transnistria, organized Soviet resistance groups, often led by former Red Army officers and supported by locals, launched attacks against Romanian garrisons, transport columns, and infrastructure. Bridges were blown up, telegraph lines cut, and supply depots raided. Romanian security responses were harsh. Villages suspected of harboring partisans were subjected to mass arrests, deportations, or punitive executions. The cycle of attack and reprisal intensified, undermining the fragile administrative order established in the autumn. Civilian governance under the Transnistrian governorate encountered structural limitations. Romanian administrators lacked experience managing large, multi-ethnic territories ravaged by war. Efforts to restore agriculture and local economies clashed with demands for requisitioning and export back to Romania. Currency confusion, lawlessness, and black market activity surged. The Romanian gendarmerie and secret police were tasked with maintaining order, but their actions, often arbitrary and violent, alienated much of the local population. Anti-Semitic policies, already a cornerstone of the Antonescu regime, were implemented systematically across the occupied territories. In late 1941 and early 1942, Romanian authorities oversaw mass deportations of Jews from Bessarabia, Bukovina, and Transnistria into ghettos and camps such as Bogdanovka, Domainevka, and Akhmetchetka. Disease, starvation, and mass shootings resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands. Though conducted under Romanian command, these actions occurred with the knowledge and ideological approval of the German SS. Coordination between Romanian and German agencies varied, but the general alignment on ethnic and racial policies reflected shared objectives. On the broader strategic front, the Axis advance had slowed. After initial victories in Ukraine and the encirclement of Soviet forces in battles such as Kiev and Uman, the German offensive was increasingly stretched. Soviet counterattacks during the winter of 1941-1942, particularly around Moscow, halted the German momentum and signaled the resilience of Soviet resistance. Romanian forces operating in support of the German southern sector were spared the worst of these counteroffensives, but faced growing pressure as Soviet probing attacks increased in intensity and frequency. Romanian military planners began to reconsider the scale and scope of their commitments. General Staff memoranda circulated in early 1942 reflected concerns about troop exhaustion, the viability of sustaining prolonged occupation, and the absence of a clear exit strategy. Yet, politically, Antonescu remained firmly committed to the Axis cause. He continued to view Romania's role as central to the anti-Soviet struggle, and believed that Romanian sacrifices would be rewarded in the post-war order. His correspondence with Hitler remained cordial, and he resisted suggestions from domestic critics to limit Romania's military exposure. Within Romania, the effects of the war were becoming more visible. Mobilization continued to draw manpower from agriculture and industry, affecting domestic production. Rationing expanded and inflation undermined purchasing power. Civil society was increasingly subordinated to wartime needs, and political dissent was suppressed. The press celebrated Romania's alliance with Germany, but the absence of clear victories and the scale of human losses quietly eroded the credibility of official narrative. Despite these difficulties, Romania prepared to expand its role. Throughout the spring of 1942, new divisions were trained and equipped for redeployment to the Eastern Front. Germany, planning its 1942 summer offensive toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad, requested additional Romanian support. In return, Berlin promised modern weaponry, tactical coordination, and a greater voice in strategic planning. Antonescu agreed, viewing this as an opportunity to solidify Romania's position and influence within the Axis bloc. As these preparations unfolded, it became clear that Romania's involvement in the war was entering a second phase, one that would require not only military endurance but political flexibility, administrative sophistication, and national resilience. The winter of 1941-1942 had exposed the limits of Romania's resources and strategy. Yet rather than recalibrating its role, Romania chose to double down, investing even more deeply in a conflict whose end was far from sight, and whose costs were only beginning to be understood. By the summer of 1942, Romania stood at the height of its wartime military engagement. The German High Command launched Case Blue, the strategic offensive aimed at capturing the Caucasus oil fields and seizing Stalingrad to secure the Volga River. Romania's 3rd and 4th armies were assigned to participate as key components of this southern thrust. German leaders expected their Romanian ally to play a major role in securing the flanks of the advancing Wehrmacht, particularly as German forces were increasingly stretched across vast distances. In preparation for this expanded commitment, Romania mobilized additional units. By mid-1942, over 38,000 Romanian troops were deployed on the Eastern Front, making Romania the second-largest Axis contributor after Germany. New infantry and cavalry divisions were sent east, while existing units were reinforced and restructured. Despite efforts to modernize, these formations still suffered from limited mechanization, inadequate anti-tank weaponry, and a shortage of modern artillery. Romanian commanders raised concerns, particularly about the lack of armored support and mobile reserves. Warnings that were acknowledged but ultimately dismissed by German planners focused on the primary objectives of Case Blue. As German Sixth Army pushed towards Stalingrad in August, Romanian troops were assigned to protect its vulnerable flanks. The Romanian Third Army, under General Dumitrescu, was deployed north of the city along the Don River, while the Fourth Army, commanded by General Constantinescu Claps, was positioned to the south. These sectors stretched across more than 300 kilometers of open steppe, lightly defended and thinly manned. Romanian forces were tasked with holding this line against a Red Army that had spent the past year recovering, rearming, and reorganizing. While the main German assault on Stalingrad intensified in September and October, Romanian troops faced escalating Soviet reconnaissance, probing attacks, and artillery shelling. Morale deteriorated rapidly. The terrain offered little natural defense, fortifications were rudimentary, and soldiers lacked adequate winter clothing and supplies. Reports from Romanian field commanders consistently warned of an impending Soviet offensive, citing buildup of enemy forces across the Don. However, these reports were not acted upon decisively. German intelligence underestimated the scale and coordination of Soviet preparations. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet Union launched Operation Uranus, two massive pincer offensives executed by the southwestern and Stalingrad fronts under Generals Vatutin and Yeremenko, struck the Romanian lines north and south of Stalingrad. The Soviet force, numbering over 1 million personnel with more than 900 tanks, 13,000 artillery pieces, and 1,100 aircraft, overwhelmed Romanian defenses within hours. The Romanian Third Army was hit first, facing three Soviet armies, including the 5th Tank Army, Romanian infantry, and anti-tank units, armed mostly with outdated 37mm and 47mm guns, were unable to stop T-34 tanks and massed artillery barrage. Within 3 days, Soviet spearheads broke through Romanian positions, encircling elements of the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad and creating chaos across Axis command structures. The Fourth Army's southern sector collapsed shortly thereafter, under the pressure of the Soviet 51st and 57th Armies. Romanian units disintegrated under combined tank and infantry assaults. Communications were lost, supply lines severed, and entire divisions ceased to function as cohesive formations. The 1st Cavalry Division and 13th Infantry Division were virtually destroyed. Only scattered units managed to retreat westward in any organized fashion. Romanian casualties during the Stalingrad campaign were catastrophic. In less than 2 weeks, over 58,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Many survivors endured freezing temperatures, starvation, and Soviet captivity. The retreat of remaining Romanian forces toward Rostov and the Mias River marked a decisive end to Romania's ability to maintain offensive operations in the east. The scale of the disaster shocked both military and political leadership in Bucharest. Antonescu, though publicly committed to the alliance with Germany, privately expressed anger at how Romanian troops had been used. He believed that Germany had entrusted Romanian forces with tasks beyond their capabilities, while failing to provide the promised equipment and reinforcements. The German command, for its part, blamed Romanian units for the collapse, often ignoring the structural inequalities and systemic neglect that had contributed to their vulnerability. The alliance, while still intact, was marked from this point forward by increased distrust and mutual recriminations. Within Romania, news of the disaster at Stalingrad was subject to strict censorship, but its impact could not be fully concealed. The return of wounded soldiers, the absence of entire units, and the growing list of missing reinforced a sense of national trauma. Families began receiving mass-produced death notices, churches held services for the fallen, and military cemeteries expanded rapidly. Although the regime tried to frame the events as a heroic sacrifice in the broader fight against communism, the scale of loss made such narratives difficult to sustain. Strategically, Romania's military position was severely weakened. Large segments of the army were destroyed or in disarray. German pressure intensified for Romania to raise new divisions to fill the void left on the front. In response, a partial remobilization was initiated in early 1943, including the recall of older reservists and accelerated training for new conscripts. Yet, even as new formations were raised, confidence in the Axis cause was faltering. Economically, the costs of the war effort continued to mount. Romania's oil exports to Germany reached record levels, but domestic shortages grew. Agricultural output declined due to labor shortages and requisitioning. Transportation infrastructure was increasingly devoted to military logistics, affecting internal trade and civilian mobility. Inflation eroded savings, and rural discontent grew as food supplies became less reliable. Meanwhile, the occupation of Transnistria became more tenuous. With German forces in retreat and partisan activity increasing, Romanian authorities struggled to maintain control. Supply lines to Odessa were threatened, and Romanian garrisons faced constant harassment. Orders were given to begin consolidating positions and preparing for potential evacuation, but such measures were delayed due to fears of political backlash. The Battle of Stalingrad represented a turning point, not just for Germany, but for Romania as well. It exposed the limits of Romanian military capacity, shattered illusions of Axis invincibility, and sowed deep divisions within the Romanian-German partnership. From this point onward, Romania's participation in the war would be increasingly defined by a struggle to balance alliance obligations with national survival, amid growing signs that the tide of war had begun to turn irrevocably against the Axis. Following the catastrophe at Stalingrad, Romania entered a period of military and political recalibration. The losses suffered during the winter of 1942-1943 had reduced much of its expeditionary force to fragments. Romanian military planners, aware that a similar Soviet offensive could repeat elsewhere along the front, focused on rebuilding depleted units, stabilizing defensive positions, and preparing for a protracted, grinding conflict. At the same time, political figures within Bucharest began to question whether continued alignment with Germany could still serve Romania's national interests. Throughout the spring and summer of 1943, Romania undertook a major effort to reconstitute its armed forces. New drafts were initiated, and units previously held in reserve were activated. A large portion of Romania's industrial and agricultural output was redirected toward military production. Uniforms, ammunition, and medical supplies were prioritized, but modernization remained difficult. Despite German promises, Romania continued to receive limited quantities of advanced weapons. Tank deliveries consisted largely of captured Soviet models or older German vehicles, such as Panzer III and Ivory variants. Air Force reinforcements included Stukas and Messerschmitt Bf 101s, but not in sufficient numbers to alter Romania's dependency on German air support. On the front, Romanian forces were redeployed in both Ukraine and Crimea. The Third Army was assigned to defensive lines near the Dnieper River, while the Fourth Army was positioned in the Crimean Peninsula. These deployments were shaped not by offensive ambitions, but by a recognition that Soviet counteroffensives were now the defining feature of the Eastern Front. German command directed Axis units to construct layered defensive systems, deploy mobile reserves, and prepare fallback positions, a clear departure from the rapid offensives of previous years. One of the most complex aspects of this new phase was the growing role of Soviet partisans. In Ukraine and Transnistria, resistance operations escalated in both scale and sophistication. Coordinated sabotage of rail lines, ambushes of convoys, and assassinations of Romanian officers became common. In response, Romanian and German forces intensified counterinsurgency measures. These included mass arrests, forced relocations, and reprisals against suspected collaborators. Villages deemed uncooperative were subject to collective punishment, a tactic aimed at deterring support for the partisans, but one that often had the opposite effect. To adapt, Romanian military doctrine began to shift. Training programs introduced new tactics in anti-partisan warfare, field engineering, and urban defense. However, these adaptations were constrained by Romania's economic situation. The war effort had overburdened the country's infrastructure. Fuel rationing became more severe, transportation delays increased, and the cost of living rose steadily. Bucharest maintained its alliance with Germany, but behind closed doors, members of the Romanian elite began discreet contacts with Allied diplomats through neutral channels such as Turkey and Sweden. These efforts, though limited, reflected a growing awareness that Axis defeat was now a real possibility. Within the army, morale became a growing concern. Letters intercepted by censors and internal reports indicated rising frustration, war weariness, and distrust toward both Romanian leadership and the German command. Desertion cases multiplied, particularly among troops assigned to occupation duties in hostile territory. The High Command responded with stricter disciplinary measures, but also with limited concessions, such as rotating units more frequently and offering small bonuses or leave incentives. Despite these measures, a sense of disillusionment continued to spread among the rank and file. Romanian forces continued to be tested on the battlefield. In April 1943, German and Romanian units launched operations to hold Crimea and maintain control of key naval facilities at Sevastopol and Feodosia. Soviet air superiority, improved coordination, and an expanding industrial base increasingly shifted the tactical balance. Romanian soldiers in Crimea, operating in isolated positions, faced growing shortages and high psychological strain. Meanwhile, German forces prioritized their own defensive needs, often leaving Romanian units to hold exposed sectors without sufficient support. The summer of 1943 also saw Romania participate in the defense of the southern Axis during the Battle of Kursk, though primarily in a supporting role. While most of the fighting was concentrated further north, Romanian logistical units, engineers, and auxiliary detachments contributed to the effort. The failure of the Kursk offensive marked the final strategic initiative for the Axis in the east. From this point forward, the Red Army would maintain the initiative. As Soviet forces advanced westward, the issue of civilian administration in occupied territories became increasingly difficult. Romanian governance in Transnistria began to collapse under the weight of retreat and disorder. Food shortages, disease outbreaks, and administrative breakdowns undermined any remaining semblance of stability. By late 1943, Romanian authorities had begun withdrawing key personnel and military garrisons, abandoning smaller outposts, and consolidating around Odessa and other major hubs. Civilian populations, especially Jews and suspected partisans, were subject to escalating violence during this withdrawal phase. Ghettos were emptied, camps liquidated, and forced marches became common. Tens of thousands died during this period from exposure, execution, or starvation. Back in Romania, the regime sought to maintain domestic cohesion. State propaganda continued to frame the war as a national crusade, invoking themes of anti-Bolshevism and territorial justice. The Orthodox Church played a prominent role in legitimizing the ongoing sacrifices, but discontent could not be fully suppressed. The loss of sons, brothers, and husbands at the front, coupled with economic hardship, eroded public patience. By the end of 1943, even loyalist newspapers began publishing more cautious articles, reflecting a subtle shift in tone. Diplomatically, Antonescu remained committed to Germany. Despite increasing Allied bombing raids across Eastern Europe and the growing proximity of the Soviet front, he resisted calls from within the royal court and opposition parties to explore a separate peace. Antonescu feared that any deviation from the Axis would result in Soviet occupation and the imposition of communism. His distrust of Moscow was shaped not only by ideology, but by Romania's traumatic experience during the 1940 Soviet annexations. Still, by early 1944, Romania's position had become untenable. Its armies were overstretched, its economy exhausted, and its population disillusioned. The German alliance, once seen as a guarantor of security and recovery, now appeared to many within Romania as a trap, one from which escape was growing more urgent but increasingly difficult. The next phase of the war would force Romania to confront this dilemma directly, as Soviet forces approached its borders and the prospect of total defeat became a question not of if, but when. In early 1944, the war reached Romania's doorstep. The Soviet Dnieper-Carpathian offensive, launched in January, shattered the German and Romanian defensive lines across southern Ukraine. As the Red Army swept westward, Romanian forces, already depleted from years of continuous warfare, were once again called upon to hold key sectors along a collapsing front. The outcome of this campaign would become the decisive turning point not only in Romania's military participation, but in its entire wartime trajectory. The offensive began with Soviet attacks across a broad arc, from the lower Dnieper to the northern edge of the Black Sea. In response, Romania deployed what remained of its Third and Fourth Armies to support German formations, particularly around Nikolaev, Krivoy Rog, and the approaches to the Dniester River. But the Axis lacked the manpower and mechanized reserves to counter the Soviet push. The Red Army, under the command of Marshal Ivan Konev and General Rodion Malinovsky, fielded overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower, backed by fresh tanks, aircraft, and a robust logistics network. Romanian troops faced a grim situation. Their defensive lines, stretched thin and often undermanned, quickly came under pressure from coordinated Soviet breakthroughs. The Third Army, deployed along the southern Bug, was driven back in a series of engagements that left entire divisions encircled or overrun. The Fourth Army, still recovering from heavy losses in Crimea, attempted to block the Soviet advance toward Bessarabia, but lacked the means to sustain prolonged resistance. As the Soviets crossed the Dniester in March 1944, Romania confronted a reality it had long hoped to avoid: a direct invasion of its pre-1940 territory. For the first time since joining the Axis, Romania itself became a battlefield. Defensive preparations intensified. Fortified lines were constructed across northern Moldova and the Prut River, but the speed of the Soviet advance outpaced construction. Refugees streamed westward from Bessarabia, recounting tales of bombardment, forced requisitions, and reprisals. Panic spread across Romanian towns and villages as civilians prepared for the return of Soviet forces, whose rule had been marked by mass deportations in 1940-41. In April, Soviet forces launched the Crimean Offensive, targeting the Axis-held peninsula, where Romanian and German forces still held key positions at Sevastopol and Kerch. Over 65,000 Romanian troops, integrated into the German 17th Army, fought under increasingly desperate conditions. The Soviet assault, delivered by land, sea, and air, quickly broke through defensive lines. While some Romanian units fought doggedly to hold the coast, evacuation efforts were chaotic and insufficient. Between April 8th and May 12th, most Romanian forces in Crimea were either killed, wounded, or captured. Only a fraction managed to escape by sea. Romania's military losses during this phase were staggering. In the first half of 1944 alone, over 100,000 Romanian soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The collapse of the Eastern Front brought Soviet troops within artillery range of Romania's northeastern border. For the Antonescu regime, the consequences were immediate and severe. German officials intensified pressure for continued Romanian loyalty, while at the same time transferring more control over domestic security, transportation, and resource extraction to German military administrators. Within the Romanian political establishment, calls for a change of course grew louder. King Michael I, who had previously maintained a ceremonial role under Antonescu's dictatorship, began consulting with opposition figures, including leaders from the National Peasant Party and the National Liberal Party. Discussions focused on the possibility of exiting the Axis and seeking an armistice with the Allies. However, any such move was fraught with risks. German troops were stationed throughout Romania, guarding key oil facilities, railway hubs, and communication centers. A failed attempt to switch sides could trigger a violent German reaction and leave the country vulnerable to occupation. Meanwhile, the civilian population bore the growing costs of the war. Allied bombing campaigns intensified. Between April and August 1944, American and British aircraft targeted strategic infrastructure across Romania, including the Ploiești oil fields, Bucharest rail yards, and Danube River ports. The bombing of Ploiești in particular inflicted significant damage on Romania's most valuable wartime asset, its petroleum industry, disrupting production and delivery to the Wehrmacht. Civilian casualties from these raids numbered in the thousands, and the destruction of housing, factories, and transportation links compounded the sense of national crisis. On the battlefield, Romanian commanders adopted increasingly defensive postures. Units constructed fallback positions along the Carpathians and the Siret River, anticipating further Soviet advances. German-Romanian cooperation remained tactically necessary, but was now marked by tension and mutual distrust. German officers accused Romanian units of underperformance and retreating without orders. Romanian commanders criticized German unwillingness to commit reserves or provide adequate air and artillery support. The summer brought the final blow. In August 1944, the Soviet Union launched the Jassy-Kishinev offensive, aimed at destroying Axis forces in eastern Romania and opening the route to the Balkans. The offensive was executed with overwhelming force. 3 Soviet fronts, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, attacked a relatively small and exhausted Axis grouping. Romanian units, already demoralized and undersupplied, offered limited resistance. Within days, the front collapsed. The destruction of Army Group South Ukraine was near total. Over 400,000 Axis troops, including around 13,000 Romanians, were killed, wounded, or captured. The Soviet breakthrough opened a wide corridor toward Bucharest and the southern Carpathians. German command centers fell into disarray. Communications were severed, and retreating units were harassed by Soviet mechanized spearheads moving rapidly west. At this critical juncture, King Michael IV and a group of civilian and military leaders decided to act. On August 23, 1944, the king ordered the arrest of Antonescu and announced Romania's immediate ceasefire and intention to join the Allies. German forces in Romania were declared hostile and ordered to disarm. Fighting broke out in Bucharest as Romanian units engaged retreating German garrisons. Within days, Soviet forces entered the capital, receiving a mixed reception from the population. The shift in allegiance marked one of the most dramatic political reversals of the war. Romania had switched sides, but at a cost. The Soviet Union, while formally accepting Romania's surrender, treated it as an occupied country. Red Army units spread rapidly throughout the country, disarming Romanian formations and establishing control over key installations. German reprisals during their retreat, particularly scorched earth tactics and destruction of infrastructure, further compounded the national disaster. Romania's gamble had now come full circle. What began as a calculated alliance to recover lost provinces had led to full-scale invasion, military collapse, and foreign occupation. The consequences would extend far beyond the battlefield, reshaping the country's political order, its sovereignty, and its place in post-war Europe. In the immediate aftermath of the August 23, 1944 coup, Romania found itself caught between the collapsing remnants of the German war effort and the advancing Soviet machine. The swift transition from Axis to Allied co-belligerent was not accompanied by clear guarantees or mutual trust. Although King Michael I's proclamation declared Romania's intent to cease hostilities with the Allies and contribute to the defeat of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union treated Romanian territory as conquered land. Soviet troops, already present in eastern regions, rapidly expanded their presence across the country, occupying major cities, communication centers, and transport routes. From a military perspective, Romania's formal entry into the Allied coalition triggered a reorganization of its armed forces under Soviet coordination. The Romanian army, despite suffering massive losses throughout the previous year, was ordered to remobilize and take part in ongoing operations against German forces in Transylvania, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Between late August and the end of 1944, over 13,000 Romanian troops were re-equipped and redeployed under the operational control of the Soviet High Command. This transition was far from seamless. Many Romanian officers were viewed with suspicion by Soviet commanders, who often bypassed Romanian chain of command or subordinated Romanian units to Red Army formations. While Soviet authorities acknowledged Romania's switch of sides, they imposed strict conditions. Romanian soldiers fought in joint operations, such as the Battle of Debrecen and the Budapest Offensive, but were denied equal strategic status. Romanian casualties in these campaigns were substantial. By the end of the war, over 17,000 Romanian soldiers had fallen fighting against the Wehrmacht after August 1944. Romania's campaign in northern Transylvania held particular symbolic and political weight. The region had been awarded to Hungary under the Second Vienna Award in 1940, and its recovery was a central objective of Romanian war participation. Soviet and Romanian forces launched a coordinated offensive in September 1944 to retake the area, culminating in battles at Turda and Cluj. The fighting was intense. German and Hungarian forces, determined to hold the territory, put up stiff resistance. Romanian divisions such as the 9th Infantry and 1st Mountain Troops played key roles in the offensive, earning Soviet recognition for their contribution. By late October, northern Transylvania had been largely recaptured. For many Romanians, this was the first tangible reward for the shift in allegiance. State propaganda emphasized the restoration of historical lands, and official ceremonies were held in liberated towns. However, these victories did little to offset the growing sense of occupation and loss of autonomy. The Red Army retained control over much of the country's infrastructure, including railways, telegraph systems, and oil installations. Romanian sovereignty, though formally acknowledged, was now deeply constrained by Soviet presence. While the military campaign continued beyond Romania's borders, the home front endured profound hardship. German retreat from Romania was marked by sabotage and destruction. Oil refineries at Ploiești were either bombed or deliberately wrecked. Bridges, rail yards, and factories were damaged or destroyed. In their wake, Soviet authorities imposed new logistical demands. Romanian resources, grain, fuel, livestock, were requisitioned under the guise of war reparations and redirected to support the Red Army's advance into Central Europe. The burden of occupation extended to political structures. The Soviet Union immediately began reshaping Romania's internal governance. Although King Michael remained head of state and a nominal coalition government was formed, real power shifted toward the Romanian Communist Party, which had been marginal and underground prior to 1944. With Soviet backing, communist leaders such as Gheorghe Gheorghiu-Dej and Anna Pauker were elevated to influential positions. They controlled key ministries, security services, and media organs, gradually displacing traditional political elites. Civilian life was marked by uncertainty and scarcity. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, especially in border regions, were caught in the crossfire or forcibly displaced. Ethnic Germans living in Romania faced mass deportations. Soviet forces began systematic arrests of individuals suspected of collaboration with the Axis. Landowners, former officers, and members of the political opposition were detained or pressured to cooperate. Though these actions were framed as part of the denazification process, they also served to dismantle traditional social hierarchies and neutralize potential resistance. King Michael, hailed by Allied media as a courageous leader, found his actual influence rapidly diminishing. Despite efforts to secure favorable treatment for Romania at upcoming Allied conferences, the Western powers deferred to Soviet authority in Eastern Europe. The Tehran and Yalta conferences solidified spheres of influence, and Romania was tacitly acknowledged to fall under Moscow's control. Hopes for a balanced post-war settlement faded as the reality of Soviet dominance became undeniable. Militarily, Romanian troops continued to participate in the Allied advance into Hungary and Slovakia through the winter of 1944 and 1945. The battles were grueling, marked by urban combat, entrenched defenses, and harsh weather. Romanian units helped encircle and assault Budapest, contributing to one of the longest and bloodiest city battles of the European War. By March 1945, Romanian forces had reached the Czechoslovak border, fighting alongside Soviet, Czech, and Yugoslav partisans. The end of hostilities in May 1945 marked a formal conclusion to Romania's military operations, but the return home offered little sense of peace or closure. Veterans were met with ambivalence, if not suspicion. The Communist Party, now entrenched in power, viewed former soldiers and officers from the Antonescu era as potential threats. Many were dismissed, marginalized, or imprisoned. Monuments and state narratives shifted emphasis from the early war years to Romania's final campaign as an Allied power, an interpretation that obscured the complexity of the nation's wartime choices. Romania's physical losses were immense. Over 300,000 military casualties, widespread destruction of industrial capacity, and long-term depletion of agricultural productivity. But perhaps greater still was the geopolitical cost. The alliance with Germany had failed to secure lasting territorial gains or strategic security. The eventual break with the Axis had come too late to preserve true independence. Though Romania had changed sides, the war's conclusion left it not liberated, but absorbed, its sovereignty subordinated to a new power, its future direction increasingly determined not in Bucharest, but in Moscow. In less than 4 years, Romania had moved from ally of Hitler to partner of Stalin, from military aggressor to occupied satellite. The transition was not one of redemption, but of recalibration, an abrupt pivot made under pressure and at great expense, in a desperate bid to preserve the national core amid shifting tides of global conflict. In the years following the end of World War II, Romania faced the long-term consequences of its wartime choices. Its alliance with Nazi Germany, subsequent military defeat, and late switch to the Allied side left the country in a politically ambiguous and strategically vulnerable position. The decisions made between 1940 and 1944 shaped not only the immediate post-war order, but also the trajectory of Romania's sovereignty, political system, and national memory for decades to come. Despite having contributed significantly to the Allied victory after August 1944, Romania was not recognized as a liberated state. Instead, it was treated as a former enemy that had switched sides too late to escape retribution. At the 1946 Paris Peace Conference, Romania's efforts to argue for more favorable terms were largely disregarded. The final treaty, signed in February 1947, restored northern Transylvania to Romania, undoing the Second Vienna Award, but confirmed the loss of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina to the Soviet Union. Reparations were imposed, amounting to approximately $300 million, payable in goods and raw materials to the USSR over 8 years. Politically, Romania transitioned rapidly from a constitutional monarchy to a Soviet-aligned People's Republic. The Romanian Communist Party, which had played a marginal role before the war, was now the dominant force in national governance. Backed by Soviet occupation troops and NKVD advisors, the party began dismantling Romania's existing political institutions. A campaign of arrests, purges, and show trials targeted former members of the military, government, aristocracy, and opposition parties. By 1946, opposition leaders were either imprisoned, forced into exile, or coerced into political subservience. The monarchy itself became a central target, though King Michael V was initially retained as a figurehead to lend legitimacy to the transitional government. His influence was systematically curtailed. In December 1947, after months of Soviet-backed political pressure, King Michael was forced to abdicate. Romania was declared a People's Republic, and the monarchy, seen as a symbol of the pre-war order, was abolished. The royal family was exiled, and their properties nationalized. Economically, Romania's post-war reconstruction was shaped by Soviet directives and the establishment of a command economy. Nationalization of industry, banks, and transportation began in 1948. Land reform, initially popular among peasants, soon gave way to forced collectivization. These changes were part of broader Soviet efforts to restructure Eastern Europe according to Marxist-Leninist principles. Romania's economy was reoriented toward heavy industry and agriculture geared toward Soviet needs, and political loyalty became a key factor in employment, education, and social mobility. The legacy of the war remained a contentious subject. The Romanian state, now under communist control, reframed the historical narrative to emphasize the liberation of the country by the Soviet Union and Romania's contribution to the defeat of fascism after August 1944. The years 1941-1944, during which Romania had fought alongside Germany, were downplayed or condemned outright. Official historiography presented Antonescu's government as a reactionary dictatorship responsible for war crimes, economic ruin, and collaboration with Hitler. While these interpretations had factual basis, they also served to obscure the broader context of national decision-making and shift all responsibility onto a few individuals. The fate of Marshal Ion Antonescu symbolized this process. After his arrest in August 1944, he was handed over to Soviet authorities and later tried by a Romanian People's Tribunal in May 1946. Convicted of war crimes and crimes against peace, he was executed by firing squad in June 1946. His trial marked the beginning of a broader effort to purge the military and civil service of those associated with the pre-1944 regime. Thousands were dismissed, imprisoned, or subjected to internal exile. Memory of the war became deeply fragmented. For many veterans, particularly those who had served before 1944, reintegration into post-war society was fraught with stigma and surveillance. Their experiences and sacrifices were excluded from official narratives. Monuments and commemorations focused exclusively on the liberating campaigns of late 1944 and 1945, while the earlier battles, at Odessa, Stalingrad, and elsewhere, were erased or vilified. In contrast, Soviet military achievements were glorified, and the Red Army was portrayed as Romania's savior. This official narrative persisted for decades. Public discussion of Romania's alliance with the Axis was tightly controlled. Academic work on the subject was limited to Marxist interpretations, emphasizing class struggle, capitalist complicity, and fascist aggression. Only in the late 1980s, and especially after the 1989 Romanian Revolution, did a broader re-examination of the wartime period become possible. Scholars, journalists, and educators began to revisit the complexities of Romania's decisions, the pressures it faced, and the multiplicity of experiences during the war. In the international arena, Romania's wartime role had long-term diplomatic implications. Its post-war alignment with the Soviet Union placed it firmly within the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War. Relations with the United States and Western Europe remained limited until the early 1960s, when Nicolae Ceausescu sought to distance himself from Moscow's influence. Even then, the shadow of the war lingered, shaping perceptions, alliances, and foreign policy for decades. The cost of Romania's war gamble was not limited to battlefield losses. Over 800,000 Romanians, military and civilian, died during the conflict. Entire regions were devastated, industries dismantled, and communities uprooted. The Jewish and Roma populations suffered persecution, deportation, and mass murder during the years of Axis collaboration. Despite post-war efforts to assign individual responsibility, the collective trauma endured. Today, Romania's role in World War II continues to be a subject of national reflection and debate. Monuments to all phases of the war, Axis and Allied, coexist in cities across the country. Historical commissions have re-examined wartime events, including participation in the Holocaust. Educational curricula now acknowledge the full arc of the war, including the early alliance with Nazi Germany and the shift in 1944. Romania's path through World War II, entering as an Axis partner, switching allegiance in the face of disaster, and emerging under Soviet domination reflects the difficult choices faced by smaller states caught between great powers. It is a story of ambition, loss, adaptation, and survival. The war did not end with peace, but with a transformation that redefined the nation's borders, institutions, and place in the world. Its legacy remains embedded in the foundations of modern Romania, a country still reckoning with the consequences of a war gamble that reshaped its future.